Good morning, guests. Good morning, colleagues. On behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, it is my great pleasure as the school's coordinator to welcome you to the 6th International Winter School today. Hello. Yes. Okay. On behalf of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, it is my great pleasure as the school's coordinator to welcome you to the 6th International Winter School today, that many of you have traveled long distances to be here is a reminder to us all just how important our work is. We are delighted to have you with us. Before I introduce you to the first lecture in this program, please allow me to give a very brief background on the Arab Center and the International Winter School. Since its foundation in 2010, the Arab Center has been drawing on top regional scholars to provide in-depth analysis and promote research-based approach to understanding issues of society and the state of the Arab world. The center established itself as a leading research center in the region and a focal point for Arab academics, and dedicated itself to the values of democracy, egalitarianism, and encountering essentialist views of the region all through scientific research. The Arab Center founded both the Doha Historical Dictionary of Arabic and the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. It has numerous units and programs, including the Unit of State and Political Systems Studies, the Iranian Studies Unit, the Strategic Studies Unit, the Arab Opinion Index, and the Palestinian National Movement Project, and also the Gulf Studies Unit. Aside from books, the center also published 7 peer-reviewed journals: Umran for Social Sciences, Tabayun for Philosophical Studies and Critical Theories, Ustur for Historical Studies, Hikama for Public Administration and Public Policy, and Siyasat for Political Science and International Relations, and Al-Muntaqa for Arab Studies, which is published, Al-Muntaqa is published in English. The center also organizes dozens of conferences and symposiums on annual basis, and this International Winter School is only one of them. Okay, the International Winter School is an annual program that seeks to provide an in-depth and critical look at selected topics. It provides an opportunity for participants to network with international and regional academics, gain substantive knowledge, and receive feedback from respected scholars. Since its inception in 2020, the Winter School has received hundreds of applications from all over the world. The theme of the first Winter School in 2020 was on communitarianism, sectarianism, and the state. The second Winter School was on the state in flux. The third one was under the title of Variations in Populism. The fourth one was on Political Culture Revisited, How Values Drive Politics. And the last one, the fifth one, was about social media surveillance and societies of control. As you already know, the topic of the 6th International Winter School is media in wartime. The theme of this school was inspired from Israel's genocide in Gaza, during which Western mainstream media coverage have aligned with the perpetrators. Media coverage has revealed not only deep seated biases favoring settler colonial war criminals, but also the alarming ease with which Palestinians are dehumanized and depersonalized. Despite efforts by Palestinians victims and their advocates to resist through social media platform and provide counter narratives, algorithmic censorship soon targeted these initiatives. To this day, content supporting Palestinians often faces removal on social media, while accounts critical of Israeli policies are frequently restricted, limiting their ability to share information. This complicity in media's coverage of Gaza genocide prompted the school to examine the evolving relationship between war and media. The program explores how war coverage is shaped by ideological and cultural biases, and topics include the dual role of journalists in wars as both targets and instruments, subject to control, censorship, and violence, or employed as tools of military power. Research projects presented by participants in this round draw in data from different war zones across the Arab world, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, Latin America, and China. I hope that the diverse empirical research projects, combined with the theoretical focus of the lectures, roundtable, and the specialized workshop we have in this round, will deepen our understanding of the complex relationship between media and war. Again, I would like to welcome you all to this program. I hope you enjoy Doha's winter life, especially through the different social activities we encourage you to join. And without further ado, let's begin our program with our first lecturer, Professor Freedman, who will deliver a lecture under the title of Embedded or Adversarial Journalism, Imperialism, and War. Dr. Freedman, allow me just 1 minute to introduce him, is the Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths, University of London. He is the author of several titles, including The Politics of Media Policy, published in 2008, and The Contradictions of Media Power, published in 2014, as well as the forthcoming Capitalism and the Media. His edited collections include War and the Media, published in 2003, and Media and Terrorism, 2012. Both books were co-authored or co-edited by Daya Fusso, and he writes for the Declassified UK. He led the 2016 inquiry into the future of public service television and is a founding member of the UK Media Reform Coalition. Dr. Des will deliver his lecture in up to 45 minutes, then
up to,
and we will then open the floor for the audience.
Between 40 minutes and 3 hours. Is that okay? Well, thank you very much. What a fantastic turnout. I'd like to thank Hani, Mariam, and Mutaz for bringing us here. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Doha. It's a real pleasure in particular to be with the 20 presenters, because I know how precious these spaces are. As someone who's been to many kind of anonymous international conferences, a workshop where we actually get to sit down, spend time together and discuss and argue and educate each other is a real pleasure, and it is quite an exceptional space. So thank you, Hani, for doing this in the first place. And I'm sure we will challenge each other over the next few days. So 45 minutes, if that's all right. Well, I'm very honored, but I'm kind of nervous as well to be the first person to deliver a lecture here at this wonderful event. I hope it's all right if I remain seated. I'm always worried that it's much better to stand. I always think if I just sit here, you might fall asleep. So if I see anyone dozing, I might just stand, but the chair is too comfortable. There's no use pretending, as Hani has already said, that the context for this particular winter school is anything other than horrific. With a minimum of 50,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, both by Israeli weapons and by Israeli policies. And this is a number that I read this morning. The Lancet have increased. They say it's more like a minimum of 65,000 people killed. And in a situation in which the Western media, as you said, have failed effectively to hold to account the perpetrators of this genocide, let alone even to name it as such, this isn't a moment in which to feel anything other than anger or frustration. Through their refusal fully to confront the perpetrators, leading platforms, broadcasters and news outlets across Europe and North America, and I'll be concentrating on Western journalism in my talk, that these platform broadcasters and news outlets are implicated in the purges of Palestinian people that are taking place across Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the assertion of Western hegemony across the entire Middle East. If mainstream media really were the monitors of power, the watchdogs, the barking dogs, the watchdogs that bark at abuses of authority and that are supposed to be central to democracy in a way that liberal accounts of journalism profess them to be, then this image, this particular image, would have been what was published by Time magazine on December the 12th. You would all know about the horrific murder of Hind Rajab back in February. I think she and the family she was killed with epitomize both the violence inflicted by Israel on the people of Gaza, as well as the Western media's largely pusillanimous and captive reporting that's marked by a clear reluctance to attribute violence to Israel and an equal reluctance to afford agency and humanity to Palestinians. If you remember, both the New York Times and the BBC led with exactly the same headline. The way they reported on the attack on the car in which Hind and her family were killed was Hind Rajab found dead in Gaza, as if this was some kind of mystery. And that story, that headline, remains unaltered on the BBC's website and, to the best of my knowledge, also on the New York Times' website to this day, despite detailed investigations by a range of organizations, including Al Jazeera, including the Washington Post, and including Forensic Architecture, which is based at my own university, Goldsmiths, in London, that proved that Hind did not mysteriously die, but was killed by occupying forces. You'll know that it wasn't Hind Rajab that was the person of the year, but instead Donald Trump. And you'll also know that the unbalanced framing, the euphemistic language, the consistent misattribution continue to dominate headlines of the atrocities in Gaza. This is just one of many. This was taken from New Year's Eve on the BBC World X feed. Gaza, can you see it all right? Actually, it's a bit small, isn't it? Oh, there are so many screens. Look around you. Gaza babies dying from the cold as winter temperatures drop. So it's apparently nature. It's apparently just random, well, it's not random cold weather. It's predictable cold weather that is responsible for killing Palestinian babies, as if it's nothing to do with the fact that Israeli bombs have destroyed the homes where these babies would otherwise be living and would be warm and would be alive. These babies are not dying from the cold. They are dying from the warfare conducted by an occupying force which sees Palestinians, as has been theorized over many years now, as collateral damage, not as humans worthy of a future, let alone of sovereignty and self-determination. Now, in my talk, I don't really want to spend, although it has preoccupied me and I'm sure all of you for many, many years, I don't want to spend more time on Gaza in this particular talk, not least because there are a whole number of papers over the next few days by people who will know much more about this than I do. So I am looking forward to learning about the situation and about your research on all of this. What I want to do is ask a broader question that is related to the coverage of Gaza, and that, again, something that preoccupies me both as a scholar, but also someone who is, whenever I have the time, a journalist and writing for Declassified UK. And that question is, how did we end up with a kind of clientelist journalism that is enthralled to the agendas of the powerful and not to the lives of the powerless? How have we ended up in a situation where, despite regulations around, for example, impartiality for many European broadcasters, despite a stated commitment to fairness and objectivity that you'll find written in the mission statements of news organizations, despite a professional culture that claims through its everyday practices and its training to emphasize accuracy, despite a normative liberal account of the media that they provide an essential check on power, how have we ended up with a journalism that is so anemic and pro-establishment? How have we ended up with a mainstream journalism that so often reproduces the political and economic interests of the most powerful groups and marginalizes the voices of the poor and the dispossessed? How have we ended up with a field that often looks more like propaganda than it does as fearless, independent reporting? How have we ended up with reporting that, frankly, and this brings me to one of the main guiding motivations for doing this talk, how have we ended up with reporting that is locked within an imperial framework of winners and losers, of colonizers and colonized, of civilized and less civilized, of worthy and not so worthy? And so in order to answer those questions, I'd like to spend some time, and there are lots of different ways of doing this. I've chosen one particular frame to contrast the liberal narrative of war reporting with one that's much more critical, that suggests that mainstream journalism in the West is still attached to, shaped by, both the theory and practice of imperialism. Now, this winter school is focused on the theme of media in wartime, but I mean, this isn't as a criticism, obviously, but when is there not wartime? When are there not military conflicts that are related to competition between states jostling for military, economic, and political power? Just to take one example, the US in this century alone has been involved in direct military intervention in countries including Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kenya, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. There are many others that I've missed out. According to a report from Brown University's Costs of War project, US post-9/11 wars have, in their phrase, forcibly displaced, their words, at least 38 million people from many of these countries. And this report predates the 7th of October, when, of course, many more people since then have been killed, made homeless, and forced to flee as a result of Israeli military activities in the region, and that this, a genocide largely funded by the US. You also have China, increasingly active across the globe, using its soft power to support countries, for example, in the global south, at the same time as being increasingly active in military terms in the South China Sea, while, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine has been going on for just under 2 years. Now, for many of you, imperialism, for those of you outside the West, imperialism is a kind of lived reality of domination that is very familiar to you. You certainly don't need me to somehow try and explain it to you. But inside the West, the idea that journalism might be shaped by historic imperialist rivalries and geopolitical inequalities is a little less popular. So please do bear with me and forgive me if any of this sounds patronizing. I'm kind of learning myself in my research while I reflect on the extent to which this, as well as conventional liberal accounts of media power, provide important contexts for journalistic practice. So what I'm going to do is look at So I'll start with a liberal account of the mainstream media as an impartial observer of military conflict. I then contrast this with a much more critical notion that the mainstream media in the West are intertwined with the military interests of their home state, and they produce content that might be seen to be closer to propaganda than it is to impartial news. So, it's so annoying having had cataract operations because I have to use these, but actually I just want to look at you, the audience, to see where you're interrogating me or looking indifferent. But forgive me, I can't do this because I have to keep looking at things. Anyway, so let me start with a much more, it's such a grim period. Why don't we pretend to be optimistic for a second? Let's close our eyes and imagine a rosy scenario in which established news outlets and experienced journalists are, as they often claim to be, crucial intermediaries between states engaged in military activities on the one hand, and the publics they claim to serve. Let's pretend that things are good. Now, this myth or reality, depending on your perspective, relates to this traditional liberal account of the media as a fourth estate, as an independent arbiter, a detached observer, an objective witness to the unraveling of historical events. And in the context of war reporting, it's a particularly important area to look at. This is an approach nurtured by stories of brave, and I am not doubting in anything I say the bravery of individual war reporters. Although I am doubting, it doesn't apply to all war reporters. There is a real difference between them. But anyway, this mythology, as I see it, is nurtured by stories of these brave unilaterals who are willing and able to shrug off security, political, organizational, and ideological restrictions to keep a watchful eye on the activities of military combatants and to challenge, where necessary, the arguments of politicians and generals during wartime. The man credited with founding the Western tradition of the independent war reporter is a man called William Howard Russell, who first covered the Crimean War in the 1850s for the British newspaper, The Times. He was the first civilian to report from the front, and he vigorously condemned what he saw in front of him, the poor military planning and the terrible conditions that led that the troops had to suffer, the troops that he saw had to suffer. His reports were widely publicized, led to the resignation of the British general in charge and the collapse of the government. It's a particularly powerful story of what one journalist can achieve and of the role of journalism in keeping an eye, a very watchful eye, on the military. And this is a notion that has lasted, the notion of the intrepid, it's a word that you will often see, of the intrepid war reporter was, and I could pick on lots of examples, but this is a PowerPoint presentation, so why not show you pictures of some of the people who have best expressed this tradition. In World War II, you had people like Martha Gellhorn, Ed Murrow, the British reporter Frank Gillard. In Vietnam, and I'll be talking much more about Vietnam in a second, the French photojournalist Catherine Leroy, Francis Fitzgerald, the US journalist David Halberstam, and more recently, a whole host of people, Dar Jamal, Robert Fisk, Marie Colvin, Janine Giovanni, and of course the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by the Israeli army in the West Bank in 2022. A journalist I'm proud to say that my department at Goldsmiths has just this year honoured by renaming our main lecture theatre after her. These are reporters who are said to maintain an honest, independent, critical, adversarial spirit, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And I want to give you one case study of all of this that epitomizes the adversarial conception of the journalist in wartime in relation to Vietnam, where it is argued that the uncensored and candid portrayal of American casualties and American brutality by its own military undermined public support and effectively, and this is the phrase that's often used, lost the war for the US. And one of the key turning points of the war was the transmission of a special report on February the 27th, 1968. That really should be a day commemorated in journalism, by journalism itself and journalism schools. February 27th, 1968. Is anyone nerdy enough to know what happened on that day? If there was a prize, you would win it if you could remember it. It's when Walter Cronkite, the most famous American news anchor of his day, returned from a trip to Vietnam where he went as a journalist to see what was going on. And, this is a man who's on the CBS network, his nightly news reports, news program, had tens of millions of viewers. It really was the agenda setter. And he argued, breaking from the network's adherence to rules that were designed to prevent such outbreaks of opinion, he dramatically said, quote, that the bloody experience of the war in Vietnam is to end in a stalemate and that outright military victory was basically impossible. Shocking
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
That was Walter Cronkite, 50.
That was a staggering moment, I would say, in journalistic history. On watching this, at the time, President Lyndon Johnson is alleged to have turned to an aide of his and to have said that, frankly, it's all over for us in Vietnam. And in his apocryphal words, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost, so not we, I. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And as the Washington Post put it in an article 50 years later, it was that Johnson's argument was that Cronkite mainstreamed anti-war sentiment. Television pictures of Vietnam as the next president, Richard Nixon, wrote later in his memoirs, television, quote, showed the terrible human suffering and sacrifice of war. The result of TV, really does seem like a long time ago when someone would have said this. TV resulted in a serious demoralization of the home front, raising the question whether America would ever again be able to fight an enemy abroad with unity and strength of purpose at home. This adversarial model suggests that the determination and critical instincts of committed journalists force governments to be more open in their justifications for war, more transparent in how they actually fight wars themselves. And according to this logic, the emergence since then of a 24/7 news cycle, the explosion of content on social media, that all of this would only have fueled the watchdog role, beloved of the liberal account of journalism, because it becomes increasingly difficult for the military to keep a lid on its activity. Fierce competition and the availability of a growing range of sources force reporters, it's argued, to go beyond official handouts, official briefings, to move beyond primary definers, to bear witness in a more robust way than previously. And it was put, I think, very eloquently in a debate in the British-based online journal Open Democracy by a BBC reporter, David Loyne, in 2003 at the start of the Iraq War. So this was a major time in which these kinds of arguments were being debated. He engaged in quite a well-known, in the British context, rebuttal of the need for peace journalism, and argued that what we really need are, quote, more traditional values such as fairness, objectivity, and balance, the only guiding lights, he argued, of good reporting. For David Loyne, speaking as a this is a traditional BBC voice, our job as reporters is only to be witnesses to the truth. Witnesses to the truth. And he insists that objectivity is, quote, the only sacred goal we have. And he finishes the article, I don't know if you can see it there, by arguing that war correspondents pursuing objectivity can at least bring light to a situation that otherwise would be marked by darkness. I don't want to say too much more because I have a feeling that Zahara will be touching on this debate a lot in her lecture tomorrow. So I hope that's done justice, just in a few minutes, to that particular conception of the role of the positive role, the literally enlightening role of the war correspondent, the war journalist. That's the optimistic side. Let's move to a slightly more critical view of all of this. I was struck by this headline in the Wall Street Journal last month. Did anyone see this? Anyone remember this particular headline? The idea that, for example, the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza, that Israel's bombing of Lebanon, the destabilization of Iran, and of course the toppling of Assad in Syria, all this means that for Western audiences, quote, the Middle East is up for grabs, that all this presents an opportunity for the West rather than an opportunity for the people of the region themselves to take control of their destinies. Well, it kind of reminded me of something else. It reminded me of something from quite a long time ago, of the scramble for Africa, as it is sometimes called, at the end of the 19th century, where European powers, notably Britain, France, and Belgium, were involved in an imperial carve-up of the African continent. And I would imagine that there would be newspaper headlines which weren't too different to that at the time. I guess that every crisis really does present a great opportunity for those who have the biggest armies. And what I want to do now is suggest that imperialist objectives and structures remain a key element, a key motivating factor, a key context. And as we know, context is something that is so important and yet often so absent from so much reporting of contemporary conflicts across the globe. And that these perspectives are bound to have a significant impact on the field of journalism. So very quickly, and I'm embarrassed to have to do this in front of such an esteemed audience, but sometimes it's worth bearing embarrassment just to do your job. How do we understand imperialism? I would argue that it is a fundamental feature of a broader system of capitalism. It is a necessary consequence of the expansionist tendencies that Marx and Engels so famously wrote about 175 years ago in the Communist Manifesto, talking of the need of a constantly expanding market for its products, chases the bourgeoisie, the new rulers, over the whole surface of the globe. It must, and what's so important in this little phrase are not the big words, it's the small words. It's the must, for me, is the important word here. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. This is not a moral choice, although at heart, of course, there were moral choices involved. But actually, it was less a moral choice than an economic imperative, as the earliest capitalist states desperately needed access, particularly from the second half, in the later stages, really, the 19th century. They needed access to raw materials, new markets, cheaper sources of labor, if they were more effectively to compete with each other. One of the earliest theorists of imperialism, Rosa Luxemburg, wrote that capitalism needs the means of production and the labor power of the whole globe for untrammeled accumulation. And she argued that this can't be a peaceful act. The international extension of the power of the earliest capitalist states necessarily, she argued, involved conflict. And writing, as she did just before the outbreak of World War I, Luxemburg argued that the imperialist phase of capitalist accumulation was marked by a number of things, including lending abroad, railroad constructions, revolutions, and wars. Force, she insisted, is the only solution open to capital to maintain its grip. Now, I understand capitalist imperialism, as David Harvey calls it, in order to differentiate it from previous forms of empire. I understand it as a form of competition between states, usually on behalf of major capitalist enterprises, but competition for influence and power that therefore frequently takes on military characteristics. And for what it's worth, this is not quite the same as colonization or colonialism, which after all is specifically about the conquest of land, resources, and labour, and the imposition of an occupier's culture, something that is obviously clearly relevant to discussions of Palestine, and also obviously, even though imperialism has all too often relied on colonising parts of the globe. Walter Rodney's influential, celebrated 1972 book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, notes that imperialism is essentially an economic phenomenon, and that it does not necessarily lead to direct political control or colonization. He argues that racism was pervasive amongst imperial elites in the 19th century, but nevertheless he argues that, quote, it was economics that determined that Europe should invest in Africa, but it was racism which confirmed the decision that the form of control should be direct colonial rule. So imperialism and colonialism are slightly different, but they are necessarily intimately linked forms of violence and control. Now, these are not, this is where, okay, you're all still hanging with me here. These are not ancient debates. I hope that this doesn't just sound like it is lecturing to my first year undergraduate students. This isn't just a historical accident confined to Westphalian nation states in the 19th century and an analogue age. These are structures that remain relevant, I think, to contemporary struggles and experiences. And of course, and I'm embarrassed to say this here, but of course the Middle East is a central crucial hotspot of imperial rivalry to this day, which, as Hani's already mentioned, is dominated by a settler colonial state that plays such an important geopolitical as well as regional role in the shape of Israel. And so the experience of Palestinians that we're going to hear lots of research about over the next few days is directly tied both to imperial power as well as to the violence of a settler colonial regime. So in this context, why should mainstream Western journalism, as an institution deeply embedded in established networks of power and influence, be able to resist the legacy and continuing impact of imperialist objectives? Why would we expect it to rise above or even to challenge these particular structures? And that really, from the earliest days of imperialism, journalism was connected to the ambitions and narratives of the major European governments. Now, there are differences, of course, in some of the histories, the media and communications histories about the role of imperialism. There is a fantastic book by Winsec and Pike called Communication and Empire, which looks in detail at the second half of the 19th century, and they, to a certain extent, downplay imperial rivalries at the expense of broader political and economic imperatives and corporate alliances in their account of 19th century communication infrastructures. But I would argue that there remains little doubt that imperial nation states at the time were keen to establish, in particular, newswire services that would reflect their imperial interests. The earliest international news agencies, for example, Havas, Wolf, and Reuters, were all closely linked to their home states in France, Germany, and the UK, respectively. Paul Starr, in his great book, The Creation of the Media, of the history of the media, he writes that in Britain, though the state didn't, and this is such a British important point about British rule, In Britain, though the state did not directly control Reuters, the foreign news service, in Britain, the state did not directly control Reuters. The foreign news service was so reliably in line with official opinion that it was given exclusive access to internal government information, such as telegrams from India, and so it gained an aura as the semi-official imperial news agency, that is in his words. And I think it's hardly a coincidence that the mythology, the first intrepid war reporter, remember him, William Howard Russell of the Times, dates back to the Crimean War, one of the earliest imperial conflicts in which Britain sought to challenge the growing influence of Russia at the time, and, you know, it was changing imperial rivalries with the decline of the Ottoman Empire and so on. Far from acting as independent and fearless checks on the operation of elite power, as liberal theory makes out, I think there's a whole different approach to understanding the role of the media in wartime that, in general, far from the liberal account of holding power to account, the Western journalism is more likely to publicize and to reinforce official sources and official narratives than they are to challenge them. News organizations, for a whole host of political organization and ideological reasons, and I'm hoping you will both provide examples and challenge me and give your own experience about this. But for all these reasons, they are much more likely to reproduce the imperial frameworks of political and military elites, what some critics describe as official propaganda, than they are to contest or to reject them. Now, I realize that propaganda is a slightly tricky concept that sometimes has, I don't know, conspiratorial objectives, overtones, and this is something that I have written about, actually. But nevertheless, I guess I am still using here the definition employed by Herman and Chomsky that refers to sets of ideas that are necessary to secure, in the words of Walter Lippmann, the manufacture of consent. So propaganda in this context is used to naturalize the ideas of the most powerful groups in society, to marginalize dissent, and above all in this particular debate, to legitimize specific military objectives. And I also think to justify, I'm thinking about today, to justify rising military budgets, because I think this is, and I don't know if there's any research that people are doing at the moment on this, but I think this is a growing, an increasingly important narrative that we see across Western journalism, that we now face a new Cold War, increasing military threats from Russia and China, and that therefore we need urgently to defend, to increase defense spending, and that much of this is amplified by the defense and security correspondence that I see. The starting point now is not, should we be decreasing military spending to address social failures in Britain, to put money into an ailing health service. It's how quickly can we increase military spending. The starting point is how quickly do we get to 3%, and as I saw on the BBC, a debate, how quickly can we get to 5%? This is the starting point. So it is by no means a marginal frame. Now, one of the best studies for me, changed my life as a student when I first read this. If I was ever jealous of a book, I think it would be this particular book by Philip Knightley. Is this a book that people are familiar with? I'm not looking at you, Zahara, I know you. Philip Knightley's The First Casualty, which is a study, importantly, at the heart of which is the study of the role of British war correspondents' contribution to propaganda machines, and has lots of examples, but I think some of his material of British journalists' involvement in World War I is particularly astonishing. And he describes how in World War I, leading British journalists, correspondents, were dressed in officers' uniforms, literally dressed in officers' uniforms. They had honorary status as captains and that they were provided with food, housing, transport, and of course, military censors standing next to them. These were the first, to the best of my knowledge, example of embedded journalists. Correspondents would draw lots as who would be able to go out and cover particular areas. Material was then pooled and sent to the censor before it was then distributed back to news organisations and then assumed form and then was distributed to British audiences. Only 2 photographers were allowed by the British Army onto the field. Both of them were army officers. Anyone else found taking photographs faced the firing squad. And as the war became increasingly bitter, the authorities felt that it was necessary to increase both censorship but also propaganda to justify what was clearly a brutal imperialist war. According to Knightley in the book, more deliberate lies were told than in any other period of history. And importantly, the whole apparatus of the state went into action to suppress the truth. What we now call, sometimes it's glibly put to us as if it's something new, what we now call fake news, conscious disinformation campaigns, flourished. There was something called the Bryce Commission report that was translated into 30 languages, and that this report, widely distributed and influential, described the horrors of the German army, how they had raped and mutilated women and children. After the war, it emerged that the Commission hadn't interviewed a single witness, and they'd used statements which had by then disappeared from Belgian refugees who weren't even under oath. And a later investigation couldn't prove any of the allegations. But actually, that wasn't the point. The point was to affect the present, not to be judged in the future. The point was to arouse hatred and condemnation of Germany, the enemy. Other atrocity stories were invented, in Knightley's words, to make the English hate the Germans as they had never hated anyone before. These included stories about Germans chopping the hands off a baby clinging to his mother, details of a German corpse factory, which was leaked by a British general who actually swapped the captions of 2 pictures, one showing German bodies being taken away for burial, the other showing horses on their way to being incinerated. Now, how familiar does all of this sound to us in the present day? It reminds me, well, it'll remind you of many things. I don't know, of Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait in 1991 ransacking a hospital and chucking babies out of an incubator, a lie that was passionately repeated in that photograph you can see there, of the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador, repeated to the US Congress, that was a key part of the strategy of winning public opinion to military intervention against Saddam Hussein. Or more recently, in the 2003 Iraq war, that Britain was 45 minutes away from Saddam's missiles. Again, very influential in legitimising British popular assent to enter the war, assent that was never popular, in my opinion. And again, this was faithfully reproduced by many broadcasters and news outlets, and we see it more recently with the idea of, I forget how many babies it was supposed to have been beheaded by Hamas on the 7th of October. But let's go back a bit, because clearly there have been examples, ones I've already mentioned, of brave reporters who did hold their governments to account and who were prepared to challenge official accounts. So how do we make sense of that? And I've already talked about American news coverage of Vietnam, which was found to have contributed to America's defeat in the war. But was it really so independent, so brave? And I think, and again here I draw on another fantastic academic work, Daniel Hannon's book In the Uncensored War, which challenges the idea that liberal accounts, that it was uncensored television coverage that lost the war for the US. And he challenges the myth that a proactive and critical media deliberately sabotage US military involvement Actually, he argues that in the beginning of the war, there was a concerted propaganda effort, as you would expect, to manage news coverage. The army at the time paid for local photographers and correspondents. Local photographers being really important, because where there were casualties, these were dramatic pictures of a boy from Des Moines being brought home in a body bag. This was a tragedy. This mobilized American support for what was going on in Vietnam. In general, he argues, a patriotic media accepted military assumptions about the aims of the war and covered US intervention in the mid-1960s favorably, privileging government sources and marginalizing oppositional ones. Up until 1968, few acts of barbarism were reported, and the sympathetic coverage, he argues, helped to prolong the war, not to cut it short. So what happened? How did you start to see different and more brutal types of pictures? And it was because of the people who are so often written out of Western news perspectives. That is, the people from the region themselves. The news changed not because of anything that happened in newsrooms. It certainly changed because of the influence of the US anti-war movement, but crucially, it changed because of what happened in Vietnam itself on the battlefield, and in particular, after the 1968 Tet Offensive, when political consensus on the war broke down. This is what, after all, Walter Cronkite saw for himself. Reporting about things were going well, he went and saw for himself, even though actually military terms, the Tet Offensive was defeated, he saw that the picture of a flawless military campaign could not be justified. It was divisions in the senior ranks of government and mass opposition to the war inside the US that shifted the emphasis of the coverage. According to Hallin, because of political divisions and poor internal communication, quote, the media became a forum for airing political differences rather than a tool of policy. In other words, the propaganda machine started to crack as the political consensus, which guided it itself, started to break down. I think this is what Lance Bennett discusses in terms of a process that he refers to as indexing, where journalists, as he puts it, index the range of voices and viewpoints in both news and editorials according to the range of views expressed in mainstream government debate. So, when government is split, as it increasingly was towards the end of that decade about Vietnam, you might expect a wider range of coverage when there are those serious cracks. In the case of Vietnam, shots of body bags and corpses, which had initially been shown for more commercial reasons, to do with drama and sentiment and power and the awfulness of individual Americans being killed, means we have to ramp up our military campaign, started to work in an opposite direction. These images now had a political resonance which contributed to anti-war sentiment. And even by the end of the war, when US society was totally split over the question of Vietnam, Hallin argues, quote, for the most part, television was a follower rather than a leader. It wasn't until the collapse of consensus was well underway that television's coverage began to turn round. And when it did turn, it only turned so far. In the end, it was the Vietnamese army which won the war, but the media unwittingly helped. And the reaction was swift to all of this. Media would have to be controlled even more tightly. As the British TV broadcaster Robin Day pointed out afterwards, one wonders if in future a democracy which has uninhibited television coverage in every home will be able to fight a war, however just. Blood, as he famously put, looks very red on the colour television screen. And this was a principle which was to guide Western governments from the Falklands War in 1984 to the Gulf War in 1991 to the recent occupations of Iraq, Afghanistan, and of course to the banning by the Israeli army of foreign journalists from Gaza. This led to the drawing up of ground rules designed to stifle the opportunity for independent or critical coverage, to more systematic PR from the military, to direct threats to those, quote, unilaterals, those independent journalists who refused at risk to their own lives to play by the rules. The creation of news pools, the mass embedding of journalists with British and American troops in Iraq in 2003, a practice which continues to this day. And if you can't persuade journalists to ride with you and to take your side, then tragically, you can also just target them, as happened when American forces shelled a Palestine hotel in Baghdad in 2003, which housed foreign journalists, or of course, as we've seen over the last year, the killing by Israel of 152 journalists in Gaza since the 7th of October. To be honest, Vietnam was the exception in terms of the possibility for at least some honest reporting rather than the rule. All too often when it comes to reporting military conflict, mainstream journalism still privileges official sources and marginalises critical voices. Journalists still speak of the national interest. They don't refer to imperial ambitions. They use all too often language designed to humanise without necessarily realising this. They humanise some actors and dehumanise others. Precisely what we've seen endlessly in Western reporting of Gaza. Ideological complicity, or at least identification with the personnel and the strategic aims of specific conflicts, has led perhaps not to the total exclusion of alternative narratives, but to an institutionalised favouring of dominant sources and narratives. And this affects, and this is what we're going to hear, I expect, in the research over the next few days, the language used to describe events and participants, the frames that are adopted, the sources that are sought, and of course the pictures that are used. So you are very glad to know I am going to wrap up in 1 minute. It's hard to conclude, and I realise I've done such a lot of generalisation, but forgive me for doing this. I'm the first speaker trying to set the tone. It's true that there have been and continue to be moments of tension between media and government, even in the West, in the reporting of war. But I think, in general, the interest of editors, senior journalists, tech moguls, generals, top politicians, they are all too often far from fundamentally opposed. Governments want supportive media frames to legitimise and sustain conflict, while with very few and honourable exceptions, and for all I know, some of those honourable exceptions are sitting in this room, editors and journalists share many of their government's ideological assumptions about the strategic objectives of war. Even when social media has made it so much easier to circulate images of war that might previously have remained hidden, mainstream media are still faced with real obstacles concerning censorship, access. They're still likely to accept the agendas, the briefings, the objectives of politicians and generals. They may criticise, journalists may criticise particular aspects of military operations, just like Russell did in the Crimean War. Specific aspects of military oppositions, but they fail regularly to challenge the underlying assumptions behind these objectives. For every truly brave unilateral reporter, there have been too many, all too eager to identify with the military, to bed themselves down in regiments and platoons, to reproduce the statements of military and political officials, and to circulate and further embed the idea that imperialist war is an inevitable, acceptable, or necessary part of human life. And let me end on this very famous but shocking photograph that you will all know. What's shocking is not just the image, and I'm sorry to show it. Of course, it's just as shocking to look at images that we see coming out of Gaza. In a way, that's not shocking. That is the reality of war. A burned corpse of an Iraqi soldier on the highway of death in Iraq in 1991. In a way, that's shocking, but what's also shocking is that the Western media, by and large, failed to publish it because it was too shocking. That, for me, tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between Western journalism and the media. That, for me, is why things need to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I can take my glasses off and see you.
Thank you, Dr. Des, for this thought-provoking, informative lecture on the different aspects of the relationship between war and media. And indeed, it shows that the case, at the beginning, the case was, the embedded journalism was at the beginning, the case. So now I'll open the floor for the audience for interventions or any questions. We'll start from Haider.
Yes.
Please introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Haider Kalabi, PhD sociology candidate at Carleton University. Thank you so much, Professor Des, for such an illuminating lecture. I just had a couple of hours to sleep, so I'm sorry. I need your help. I don't have a question. I was thinking as you were talking about this issue here, and since you cited, so I just took a few comments here. Since you cited Karl Marx and his friend Engels, and Rosa Luxemburg and David Harvey, I was thinking to think more dialectically about this issue of media in wartime. So thinking about questioning the ontological assumptions of mainstream understanding, the way we try to understand these issues, trying to understand the problem, the issue at hand, which is wartime media in wartime, through idealist framework. Which emphasizes the ideological role of liberalism versus non-liberalist, liberalist versus non-liberalist, instead of more materialist understanding, which emphasizes materialist conditions, geopolitical conditions. So what I'm trying to say, So the argument that the hypocrisy of mainstream Western media is well established, and we can see it in newspapers when they talk about when they frame what's taking place in Gaza. But can't we argue that other powers use this strategy, the tragedy that is taking place in Gaza? I was thinking of Russia, for example, other rising powers, to further their geopolitical interests. If we come to this conclusion that journalism in wartime is just an extension of military power, of political power, isn't it just an illusion to keep thinking about objectivity in journalism and all of that? Is it just an illusion that we'll never get? Maybe the only way is for us researchers, for people trying to understand these issues, the antidote is just to be critical of all journalism, just like I don't remember his name, but he said all propaganda is lies, even if you're telling the truth. So in journalism, it's all about propagating ideas, and so it's just a comment. Sorry, it's just not a question. And thank you.
Thank you. I've broken the mic, which isn't a very good way of starting, but do you want to take more questions? I'm happy to come back on that.
It's better actually to take more questions. Mr. Please introduce yourself, please.
I pressed the button, right? Okay. Hi, my name is Rachel Horvath. I am a third-year PhD student in political science at Rutgers University in the U.S. So I have a bunch of questions that aren't completely coherent, so I might just ramble for a second. But I'm wondering if you think that this trust in media has changed historically. Has it gotten worse? Because I would say, especially from an American perspective, a lot of Americans have I've seen discourse about how at this moment the trust is even worse than it's ever been. And then with that trust being so damaged in the legacy media, is the turn to non-traditional media at least somewhat concerning to you in some ways? And then how does the availability of alternative media and like the age of social media play in this? It's kind of related to this like non-traditional media being more, this like turn towards it happening more frequently. So yeah, those are just like three kind of incoherent questions that I have.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor, for such an incredible. I'm here. My name is Osman. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at New York University. For me, it's just a thought, especially when you gave an example about Vietnam and showing it as an example of how media can be used or can use itself as a voice for fighting back to the elites and to stop this conflict. I'm wondering about how you're thinking through the political economy of journalism itself as a factor that probably will make it hard, even if you have individual journalists who are trying to, advocate for peace and to stop the war. Just wondering your thoughts on the political economy as a condition that makes it hard for even people who have different ideas and who will want to stop some of these wars. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Aisha. Please, Dr. Aisha, also introduce yourself. I know you, but introduce yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Freedman, for this very insightful presentation. Very much appreciated. I just want to touch on the role of whistleblowers in this process because I don't see it in the program. And also, I didn't see it in the way you spoke about the challenge of those who try to challenge the official narratives. And the question is, we've noticed that whistleblowers have played a major role in some conflicts, and they managed to shift the public opinion. Thinking of Ronald Ridenauer in the case of Vietnam, Chelsea Manning in another case. But in the case of Gaza, we've also witnessed that many whistleblowers, both within the Israeli army, I think there was the case where some Israeli officers leaked footage on the detention center challenging the official narrative, but also within the journalistic community in New York Times and CNN, several journalists blew the whistle on their own employees, leaking important information, challenging also their narrative. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on the role of whistleblowers within this media issue and conflicts. Thank you.
Okay, before I proceed with the questions, Mu'taz has already sent me a note that for non-participants, only for non-participants who registered for the school, just to confirm their registration by scanning the QR code, which will be visible, I think, somewhere here after the lecture. Okay, let's proceed.
Perfect. Thank you. Luis Peche from Mexico, PhD candidate at Heidelberg University. My question is a little bit broader in terms of, and a little bit more future-looking, let's say. Where do we go from here? I mean, we see a situation in which there is great, let's say, kidnapping or a great continuous use of news media, be it state-led media or even also private media, to advance propaganda in, for instance, in the case of the war in Gaza or in the war in Ukraine. So what is the role that things like media development, media literacy, or fact-checking programs can play in countering this situation?
Thank you. Any other questions, interventions? So, okay, just introduce yourself, please.
Hello, my name is Mustafa Bostani. I am a PhD researcher in international politics at the Bundeswehr University in Munich, in Germany. So my question is regarding, first of all, thank you very much, Beth, for your very fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. I have a question where you actually end up your talk about the role of social media. As a journalist, I wanted to know your take on the role of social media. If you see any emancipatory role, or do you believe that it could bring more diversity, more independence, and critical views to the status of journalism, or do you think that it's more kind of reflecting media outlet, investors' preferences, and also you talked also about capitalism and imperial practices, and we know that social media outlets are also part of the story, the game. So I wanted to know your take on if you see any emancipatory aspect to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. I'm going to need a lot of time to come back on all of them tonight, and we have 4 minutes, so I may not get to everything, but that's why we have 5 days. And everyone else can answer the questions. You know, about social media, we're going to need weeks. So just to start, thank you for your comments. You described, I think you were referring to what I'd said, the idea that journalism is an extension of military power. Now, I don't want it to be. And in some ways, it is not. It is not the same. And I think to conflate it as exactly the same would be minimizing the ferocity of the military aspect and homogenizing the experience of journalism. And I think there are some important differences. On the other hand, how do you argue that it isn't functioning as an extension, in league with, associated with the objectives? So actually the way you put it then is something that does preoccupy me as a starting point, is in what ways can we see that journalism functions as an extension or not of military power? So going on to Rachel, the question of trust. There are huge declines in trust. Britain is top of the league for declines in trust. In other words, it has the worst levels of trust in its media, which is odd when you think of the reputation of something like the BBC. BBC has higher levels of trust than social media, than online media in Britain. But nevertheless, across the board, there's a huge increase in distrust. This is there isn't a straight answer to this. At one level, it is a positive thing, if I'm speaking very quickly. It's a positive thing because it means that the mainstream media's hegemony on a particular consensual view of the world is starting to fragment. I think that's a healthy thing. That is about increased, though I don't use the phrase a lot, media literacy. Audiences are learning not to take for granted the messages that are placed in front of them. That can only be a good thing. On the other hand, how can I say this when a lot of that cynicism, the exact words that I've just said, don't trust the legacy media, the person who says that to me probably 50 times a day in my feed happens to be the world's richest man and the man in charge of one of the most powerful communications networks. So I realize that this is a profoundly contradictory situation we're in, that there are people exploiting declining trust in the legacy media in order to cultivate their own particular and, in my opinion, dangerous worldviews. I don't want to rubbish the idea of trust. Trust still remains high for particular institutions. By and large, in Britain, there are still high levels of trust for example, the medical profession. That's a good thing. I don't want to go to the doctor where I don't trust this particular person. There wouldn't be much point. I might as well just use the online service that the NHS is happy to give me, and fingers crossed. People still trust each other, interestingly enough, according to the data. But I don't know how much now they trust university professors. That has started to decline, which is a real tragedy. But we want to get to the situation. We want to have the conditions in which journalists are able to be trusted. But I don't think we have those conditions for all sorts of historical reasons. So in a way, that sounds like I'm sitting on the fence. That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying that it is extremely contradictory, that there are some elements I welcome because we have to break through this seemingly impenetrable grip of established sources, but without them being replaced by equally untrustworthy sources. Is the turn to non-traditional media positive or not? My answer is the same. You're going to get really bored with my answers. It isn't a yes or no. I mean, at one level, of course. What would we do without partly the sheer bravery of some of the journalists who are operating using social media from within Gaza, but also these are social media activists and journalists across, not just inside Gaza, all over the world, to whom we owe a great debt for circulating different narratives and for challenging established narratives. And it's very important that they are doing this. But the idea that social media, I guess I'm answering the two questions here, that social media could distance itself from the relations, from the social relations in which it was created and in which it was sustained, would be precisely the kind of idealistic framework that our friend over there was talking about at the very beginning. There are lots of people now who are leaving, for example, X to go to Blue Sky, and I understand that. But there's a bit of me, and I'm sure the same thing will absolutely happen with Meta, with Facebook now, and I understand that. But I do sort of think, did you really think that as it was Twitter and Facebook 10 years ago were unadulterated, peaceful spaces? They were not. They have never been trustworthy spaces for democratic dialogue, which you would not expect in a world that is unequal as it is. We use the spaces that are available to us to the best of our abilities, and we fight, I hope, to protect as much as we can of the freedom of those spaces from the intrusion of states and billionaire tech moguls. And to the extent that there is an official boycott campaign for one platform or another, that might play an important role in democratizing the wider landscape. But no space is a pure space. And there are dangers with Blue Sky just being a space where like-minded people talk to each other. That is not the point of the media. We should be having exchanges wherever we can, but those exchanges, both in social media and in more legacy spaces, are not clearly equal spaces. And that should be our starting point, is how do we democratize those spaces, which takes us to the political economy of journalism. I speak as a political economy scholar. I'm very interested in the conditions which facilitate or prevent particular types of journalism. It is a real problem that the current political economy has made it more difficult to sustain investigative journalism across the Western media. We have lost important spaces for journalistic inquiry because of a shifting of journalistic priorities. That's not something I'm indifferent about. I would take a stand on that. So the political economy has shaped the extent to which we are able to hold particular military and, over the question of defense, this is extremely crucial. But there's a bit of me that also thinks we can't use political economy as an excuse either. Yes, it's true that that the commercial priorities and strategic priorities are skewing journalism away from the role I would like to see it play. But when has it not done that? We have seen, as I've tried to argue, imperial agendas in journalism since its very founding. So we should be alert to the impacts of, as Robert McChesney puts it, hyper-commercialization. We should also be very alert to the intrusion, the historic intrusion of the state, which is not something that is just endemic to the West, but obviously to the rest of the world. Whistleblowing and fact-checking, just to almost to wrap up. I am in awe, speaking personally, of the bravery of those individuals who play such a critical role in facilitating the circulation of information that would have been suppressed otherwise. This is something, obviously, again, that isn't something just recent, critical in the Vietnam War and in years preceding it. But the problem is at the institutional level. There are, just take an example of the BBC. We know that there are many, many debates inside the BBC of journalists who are very unhappy about the direction that the BBC as an institution has taken over the reporting of Gaza. We know that for a fact. Sadly, there has been very little whistleblowing because the staff there, frankly, from what it's been put to me, are very nervous. There is a culture of fear inside the BBC. Whatever the senior editorial staff will say in response to me there, how do they account for hundreds of journalists writing a letter anonymously that was published in The Independent, criticising the editorial priorities? So for every brave whistleblower who has allowed us to see beyond the official version, we have to face up to institutional pressure that is exercised on journalists as a whole. Fact checkers, I think, again, I think it depends. Fact checking is quite a diverse sphere. At the moment, there's a bit of me that thinks that Meta's recent decision to scrap fact checking is obviously a regressive step that is taken because of political opportunism. But it's not the case that having fact checkers at Meta prevented it from playing an extremely reactionary role in elections, for example, around the world. There are structural problems that fact checkers were never able to deal with. At one level, all I'm saying is I wouldn't want to be a fact checker. What a tough job it is, because you're banging your head against a brick wall. So I salute them, but once again, I think that we have to ask wider questions, I guess going back to the political economy, but also to political challenges to the structures themselves. And finally, just using the language, because we're running over, can social media be emancipatory? I mean, it's just not a question about social media. Social media is absolutely essential to providing a challenge to established discourses. But I would argue there are spaces within traditional media. We only have to think about the very contradictory role of, for example, Al Jazeera as a traditional station, the role that it has in the West of challenging official narratives. I don't do it anymore because I've become so boring, of just showing the difference between a British news organisation saying 50 people killed by Israeli bombs, says the ministry. And then Al Jazeera saying 50 people killed in Gaza, full stop. I've gotten bored of just doing that. But that's a crucial difference to me. On the other hand, of course it doesn't mean that Al Jazeera doesn't have its own strategic considerations and power plays. Those are ones I hope to hear about over the next few days. So this is a question of emancipation that is common and important for us to talk about in relation to all parts of the media. And that's what I hope we will be dealing with over the next few days. But I must stop. Thank you for all the wonderful questions.
Thank you, Dr. Des, for this fascinating lecture. Again, I want just to ask non-participants, those people who registered to come to attend the school, just to confirm their participation, their registration on the screens right now. And we'll get back